Hello, this is Shmuel Moshe, and you are listening to the Weekly Parashahcast, the weekly Torah portion podcast where I read the weekly Torah portion and then provide my own interpretation based on what I think it means. As always, I remind everybody I am not a professional Torah scholar, just somebody who wanted to study the Torah. This week's Torah portion is Behar, landing on the 17th of Iyar, 5784, May 25th, 2024, starting in Leviticus chapter 25 with verse 1. You could follow along in English on Chabad.org. The meaning of Behar is on Mount, referring to on Mount Sinai. Let's begin. Chapter 25, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, When you come to the land that I am giving you, the land shall rest a Sabbath to the Lord. You may sow your field for 6 years, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard, and gather in its produce. But in the 7th year the land shall have a complete rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor shall you prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest, and you shall not pick the grapes you had set aside for yourself, for it shall be a year of rest for the land. And the produce of the Sabbath of the land shall be yours to eat for you, for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and resident who live with you. And all of its produce may be eaten also by your domestic animals and by the beasts that are in your land. And you shall count for yourself 7 sabbatical years, 7 years 7 times, and the days of these 7 sabbatical years shall amount to 49 years for you. You shall proclaim with the shofar blasts in the 7th month on the 10th of the month on the Day of Atonement. You shall sound the shofar throughout your land. And you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim freedom for slaves throughout the land for all who live on it. It shall be a Jubilee for you. And you shall return each man to his property, and you shall return each man to his family. The 50th year shall be a Jubilee for you. You shall not sow, nor shall you reap its aftergrowth, or pick its grapes that you had set aside for yourself. For it is a Jubilee. It shall be holy for you. You shall eat its produce from the field. During this Jubilee year you shall return each man to his property. All right, so there we go. The end of the first portion, learning about the sabbatical years of harvest and for the land, as well as the Jubilee years. So the idea is that every 7 years, when they are in the Holy Land, on the 7th year, they're going to let the land rest. So this means don't go working the land, don't go forcing it to keep producing. And if we look at this in an agricultural context, this actually has some precedent for being a very good strategy, as we've learned later on in history and in agricultural science. Letting the land recover is actually really good for the soil. It allows it to retain and recover some of its potential. And, this also ties into things like crop rotation and so on. So it's very interesting to see this agricultural insight being provided through the Torah. Now, beyond that, we also learn about the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year is very interesting. Now, we have heard plenty of times about the conditional slavery that existed for when somebody could be hired as a slave or made into a slave to pay off a debt, things of that nature. In the Jubilee year, on the 50th year, what will happen is that all the slaves throughout the land will go free and return to their own property, return to their own family. It's very, very interesting to see this idea, but basically it's just a reset button that allows all people of all economic background to be freed of their bondage, even if they still had time to pay it off. It's very, very interesting that every 50 years, it's basically a cultural reset button on who is in the slave class. So with all that said, it says not only that he shall return to his family, also he shall return to his property. Now on to the second portion, chapter 25, verse 14. And when you make a sale to your fellow Jew, or make a purchase from the hand of your fellow Jew, you shall not wrong one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall purchase from your fellow Jew, according to the number of years of crops he shall sell to you. The more the remaining years, you shall increase its purchase price, and the fewer the remaining years, you shall decrease its purchase price, because he is selling you a number of crops. And you shall not wrong one man his fellow Jew, and you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. You shall perform my statutes, keep my ordinances, and perform them, then you will live on the land securely. So here we are, the very short second portion. The idea is about transactions here between fellow Jews. Don't wrong one another, but also it notes here, depending on when you sell your crops. So let's say you make a purchase, you make an arrangement, you say, I'm going to sell you the produce of my land for X amount of years. Now, according to the Jubilee year, what's going to happen is, of course, if I say to somebody, I'd like to buy the rights to all of the crops of your land, the Jubilee year does not allow that deal to last in perpetuity. The Jubilee means it can be no longer than 49 full years that somebody can purchase something like crops. And at the end of that time, it is then returned to the original farm owner. So this prevented people from being able to get caught in some sort of permanent land deal in which all of their crops would essentially turn into something like a potato famine situation, right? So obviously something we don't want to have happen. We don't want people to lose the right to the crops of their own family's land. So it is ultimately priced relative to how many years before or after the Jubilee. And then at the end of that seems to be the limit, the statute of limitations on how long one can have an acquisition of another person's crops, and also how to price it accordingly. You're basically paying for X amount of seasons worth of crop. Interestingly, this also really emphasizes the importance of not screwing over your fellow Jew in business, so pay close attention. It's pretty important. You shall not wrong one man his fellow Jew, and you shall fear your God. So this is, of course, talking about fraternity, but it's also interesting that as much as this is specifically saying this about how to treat your fellow, it is also worth noting, as for the stranger, so too the citizen, right? So this sort of gives an implication that you should always remember how you should treat others. It really should be universal. On to the third portion. Chapter 25, verse 19. And the land will then yield its fruit, and you will eat it to satiety, and live upon it securely. And if you should say, What will we eat in the 7th year? We will not sow, and we will not gather in our produce. Know then that I will command my blessing for you in the 6th year, and it will yield produce for 3 years. And you will sow in the 8th year, while still eating from the old crops until the 9th year. Until the arrival of this crop, you will eat the old crop. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land belongs to me, for you are strangers and temporary residents with me. Therefore, throughout the land of your possession, you shall give redemption for the land. All right, another very short portion. So first up, talking about the yielding of the fruit, right? We're saying you're going to honor this Jubilee arrangement on the 7th year. Don't farm the crops. And also, keep in mind, you may ask yourself, well, what am I going to eat if I'm not allowed to actually farm anything on year 7? Well, we are being given a promise here. On year 6, you will be allowed, or you will receive triple the harvest. So essentially, you don't need to be afraid, because not only are you going to be covered for year 7, but also for year 8 and for year 9 will you still be finishing that off. So that's something not to worry about. And also keep in mind, you cannot sell the land permanently, because this promised land is not even yours, really. This promised land actually belongs to the Lord. You're just living in it. Therefore, throughout the land of your possession, you shall give redemption for the land. In other words, you're just leasing it from me. On to the fourth portion, chapter 25, verse 25. If your brother becomes destitute and sells some of his inherited property, his redeemer who is related to him shall come forth and redeem his brother's sale. And if a man does not have a redeemer, but he gains enough means to afford its redemption, he shall calculate the years for which the land has been sold, and return the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, and then he may return to his inheritance. But if he cannot afford enough to repay him, his sale shall remain in the possession of the one who has purchased it until the Jubilee year, and then in the Jubilee year it shall go out and revert to his inheritance. Another very short portion, but cannot be understated. Or even overstated. This is extremely important. We're talking about what happens when somebody is so down on their luck that they have no choice but to sell what they have inherited, the land that they inherited from their father. So you have a family who has been passing down this plot of land for generations, and now one of them is down on his luck. He's lost all of his money. He just can't afford to get by. The only thing he can do is sell his land. It's all he has left. This states that if that happens, he must, if possible, have that sale be redeemed or reimbursed and reacquired by one of his fellows. So say he has a cousin or a brother who is doing okay, and this man sells his land to some stranger. The family member, the redeemer, has to then go forth and basically buy it back at the reasonable fair price, based on how much it was. He has to go ahead and redeem it for his destitute brother. Now, what's also going to happen is, if that is not possible, what can also take place is that after the man does get back on his feet, he can then have the land sold back to him, and you basically just will settle the difference based on how much it's already been used and also how much time is left. And what I mean by time is left, I mean until the next Jubilee year. So at the last portions or last verse here, it says, in the Jubilee year, it shall go out and revert to his inheritance. So essentially what this does, and we can use modern day real estate as a fine example. I think you've heard of, if you've ever heard of the old West, expanding and people having a plot of land, and then suddenly someone comes in and starts buying up or taking all the land that people inherited or purchased or what have you. The idea is there's no way in the land of Israel, following the Torah, it is impossible for somebody to lose their family plot. The family land, the family's resident property, will always go back to that family during the Jubilee year. So no person will become homeless without any inheritance of land that he had because of his circumstances. The Jubilee year will be when that is redeemed to him and he gets it back and is able to return to his residence. Again, this is only once every 50 years, so I'm sure there were folks who had the chance to game the system, but ultimately this prevents descendants from suffering the loss of what would have been their inheritance because their father maybe had no money and lost their inheritance. Now it goes back to the appropriate family. On to the fifth portion, chapter 25, verse 29. And when a man sells a residential house in a walled city, its redemption may take place until the completion of the year of its sale. Its period of redemption shall be a full year. But if it is not redeemed by the end of a complete year, then the house which is in the city that has a wall shall remain permanently the property of one who purchased it throughout his generations. It will not leave his possession in the Jubilee. But houses in open cities, which do not have a wall surrounding them, are to be considered as the field of the land. It may have a redemption, and shall leave the purchaser's possession in the Jubilee. And regarding the cities of the Levites, the houses of their inherited cities shall forever have a right of redemption for the Levites. And if one purchases from the Levites, whether a house or an inherited city, will leave the possession of the purchaser in the Jubilee, because the houses of the cities of the Levites are their inherited property amidst the children of Israel. And a field in the open areas of their open cities cannot be sold, because it is their eternal inheritance. If your brother becomes destitute and his hand falters beside you, you shall support him, whether a convert or a resident, so that he can live with you. You shall not take from him interest or increase, and you shall fear your God, and let your brother live with you. You shall not give him your money with interest, nor shall you give your food with increase. I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan, to be a God to you. All right, so now we come to the end of this portion, number 5. So first off, we hear there is a distinction. When it comes to property that you give up or sell or whatever it may be, inside of a city that has walls, a walled city. So this is a city whose borders are fairly hard to find. Inside of a walled city, you have 1 year to redeem a property that you have sold. If it is not redeemed within 1 year, that sale is final forever. No Jubilee redemption. It simply is a final transaction. And if you want it back later, you're going to have to buy it back like any other transaction. However, if it's an open city that does not have walls, that is a different story. Those houses are treated just like the open field that we've talked about earlier in this portion. Those are redeemed to their people. Also, the cities of the Levites, something that we recall when we hear about who's going to inherit what. All of the different tribes receive various different plots of land, except for the Levites, who receive cities inside of everyone else's land. So rather than being in a single spot, the Levites, as a holy people, are designated to be inside of all of the cities, And when it comes to their land, it is always redeemed back to the Levites because it is their inheritance. Just like the rest of the land is inherited by each individual person, the Levites have an inheritance right in that city. So it doesn't matter what they purchase from the Levites. In the Jubilee, it goes back to the Levites. Now, beyond that, we also hear if your brother becomes destitute. So let's say your brother becomes poor, he's down on his luck, he can't afford to get by. You shall support him, whether he's a convert or a resident. So this means it doesn't matter. If he is of the people Israel, you support him while he is down on his luck, while he is downtrodden, while he is not in a financial state to be able to hold himself upright. You hold him upright. You let him live with you, and you support him so he can get on his feet, and you do not charge him interest, nor do you raise the amount that you let him have to pay you back. So if he borrows $10,000 from you, when it's time to repay you, it's going to be no more than $10,000, even if it's been time past. No interest. You do this because this is what is according to the will of the Lord. Same thing with any food you give him. If you give him 100 pounds of corn, you are not going to demand, but give me back 150. You simply get the 100 back, not increase. And remember, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be a God to you. So don't forget who's telling you this. Do not take advantage, but instead uplift your brother. On to the sixth portion, chapter 25, verse number 39. And if your brother becomes destitute with you and is sold to you, you do not work him with slave labor. As an employee or a hired resident he shall be with you. Until the Jubilee year he shall work with you. Then he shall leave you, he and his children with him, and he shall return to his family and resume the status of his fathers. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as a slave is sold. You shall not work him with rigor, and you shall fear your God. Your male slave or female slave, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may acquire a male slave or a female slave. And also from the children of the residents that live among you, from them you may acquire slaves, and from their family that is with you, whom they begot in your land, and they shall become your inheritance. You shall hold on to them as an inheritance for your children after you, as acquired property, and may thus have them serve you forever. But as for your brethren, the children of Israel, a man shall not work his brother with rigor. All right, so now we learn about the slavery difference, the slavery designation that happens here when somebody becomes destitute. Again, and this is specifically how you treat a fellow Hebrew among the Jews. Okay, this is if he's down on his luck and he comes to live with you and you take him in, treat him like a hired worker. Don't treat him like a slave. And this is because you are the redeemed, right? Redeemed from Egypt. And this is a circumstance in which you cannot take advantage of him. Instead, you treat him well. You treat him like you hired him rather than the other way around. You don't treat him like those other folks. And when you work him, don't work him ragged like a slave. Work him just like a normal job. In the Jubilee year, he's going to go free, along with his children with him. Now, this is a very important distinction because, remember, we learned previously that there are circumstances where a man can be put into slavery due to a debt that he has to a fellow. So here we have somebody who's just simply down in his luck, and he's got no money, so you're offering to help him because it's what he needs. Comparatively, we've got the guy who has stolen something and has gone into debt because he owes the recompensation, or perhaps somebody who has caused an injury and has to repay that through slavery. So those folks have a different designation. But for someone who's just down on his luck and has no money at the moment, you can bring him in, give him a good life as a hired worker among you. Don't treat him like a slave. And when he leaves, his children go with him. Again, this is important because the previous example I just mentioned, those children will stay with the slave owner. So let's say a Hebrew man does a crime, has to pay restitution. He then does his restitution by being a slave. He has children with the slaves of the person who has temporary ownership of him, and then that person has to leave the children as property after he leaves that status of slavery. Not the same for someone that you're helping but get back on their feet. Now, when it comes to male and female slaves that come from the neighboring nations, that's a different story. You can acquire them as slaves because they are not the same as the redeemed of Israel. Likewise, children of the residents that live among you, from them you can get slaves too. So this is also for the non-Jews dwelling in the land. You can also take slaves from them. And unlike with the example of the fellow Hebrew, these slaves, their children, become part of the inheritance that's passed on to your own children because they are treated as property. So keep this in mind. If they are your fellow brethren, whether they're convert or resident, and I think that's very important, right? This is someone who is a convert is treated with full equal status. So this could be someone from a neighboring nation who then converted. This could be someone from within the nation who then converted. Once that happens, this changes everything. The people of Israel, convert or otherwise, must be recognized as your brethren and given this designation. Those who don't, however, there you go. You can work those non-Jews as slaves, according to this, right? But for those who do hold the same commandments, you cannot work them overmuch as slaves. They are your brethren. Don't work them with rigor. Now on to the final portion, the seventh portion. Chapter 25, verse 47. If a resident non-Jew gains wealth with you, and your brother becomes destitute with him and is sold to a resident non-Jew among you or to an idol of the family of a non-Jew, after he is sold, he shall have redemption. One of his brothers shall redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin shall redeem him, or the closest other relative from his family shall redeem him. Or if he becomes able to afford it, he can be redeemed on his own. He shall calculate with his purchaser the number of years from the year of his being sold to him until the Jubilee year. Then the purchase price shall be divided by the number of years, as the days of a hired worker he shall be with him. If there are still many years, according to them, he shall return his redemption money out of the money for which he was purchased. But if only a few years remain until the Jubilee year, he shall make the same calculation. According to his years that remain until Jubilee, he shall return the redemption money. He shall be with him as an employee hired year by year. He shall not enslave him with rigor in your sight. And if he is not redeemed through any of these ways, he shall go out in the Jubilee year, he and his children with him. For the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants, whom I took out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Chapter 26, verse 1, You shall not make idols for yourselves, nor shall you set up a statue or a monument for yourselves. And in your land you shall not place a pavement stone on which to prostrate yourselves, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and fear my sanctuary. I am the Lord. All right, that concludes the seventh portion. So first up, here we learn about what happens if, let's say you have a non-Jew who lives in the land, totally normal, law-abiding citizen. He takes... he has some money, right? He's successful. He's doing great. And suddenly your fellow Jew becomes poor and is taken up by this man. Or this resident non-Jew has the money, so he buys the Jew to work for him or to work for an idol of the family of the non-Jew. After he's sold, he shall have redemption. So what this means is one of his family members will immediately pay the price that it was. So, okay, you just bought this man for 1,000 pieces of silver. Right away after the deal is done, sir, I'd like to reimburse you that 1,000 silver pieces and redeem my brother. That is what must be done. So, in other words, the people of Israel cannot be left in this situation where they are slaves to another people. It simply cannot be. It is not permissible, and it must be done that he can be redeemed for his value. Now, if for some reason he is unable to do it, then that will result in some manner of negotiation when it comes to, we hear or see here, he gets money of his own accord, and now he pays off the balance, essentially, based on how long it's going to be until the Jubilee year. Remember that the people dwelling in the land, all the people have to acknowledge this Jubilee year, so he can determine what the cost was. So if he was purchased for 1,000 pieces, and there are 7 years left, or let's say 10 years left, right, and it's been 3 years, and now he wants to redeem himself, then his cost of redemption will only be 70 silver pieces, because it was 10 per year, right, was the value of, if he was purchased for 100 until the 10th year, then that would mean that he only has to pay, the remaining 70 silver pieces. So that's basically how it's going to be, and it says here, as the days of a hired worker, he shall be with him. If there are still many years, right, so it's going to be, if there are many years left, he shall return his redemption money out of the money which he was purchased. So basically, make sure you give an appropriate reimbursement if somebody is redeemed. But if it's only a little bit, again, just do the math and do it right. Now, it notes it here. Treat it like an employee hired year by year. And of course, if he is remaining enslaved, do not let him get treated with rigor. So don't let him be worked like a ragged slave. Make sure he's treated like a hired help, because again, just don't let this happen to your fellow. And then, of course, a reminder, the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants. In other words, they're my servants, not someone else's. Now on to chapter 26, the last two. Reminder, you shall not make idols for yourselves, shall not set up a statue or a monument for yourselves, and shall not place pavement stones on which to prostrate yourselves. So here we have a very, very clear assignment, right? Don't make an idol, don't make a statue or a monument, and don't set up a stone to bow on. So here we have, in no uncertain terms, there can be some distinctions. Some people may say, well, I don't mean to, I'm not saying this to put anyone down who's listening, right? You go to someplace like a church that has a statue of a person. Well, according to Leviticus chapter 26, verse 1, even if you are not worshiping that statue, you're still not fulfilling this commandment, which says, nor shall you set up a statue or a monument for yourselves, right? So even though you may not look at it as an idol or treat it as an idol, the commandment very clearly says, don't make an idol. Also, don't set up a statue or a monument. And then also don't make stones on which to prostrate yourselves. So it's kind of interesting. I think there's a lot to be said archaeologically. I remember somebody once asked the question, I was reading in a forum online, for all of the different, for how great the Israelites supposedly were, isn't it strange that we don't find any statues or art that they made? Were they ever really a people? I remember the person was asking this question in earnest. He was saying, I just don't understand. The Greeks have all these statues, and the Romans have statues, and all these different cultures have statues that prove that they were there and that they were artists. So what's the deal? Why are there no statues in Israel? And it's a very simple reason. It's forbidden, right? It may be an expression of art, but according to this, it is forbidden. Why? Well, it's a slippery slope. I think we can all acknowledge that there's a slippery slope when you have a statue that can become an idol over time, right? So just don't do it. Same thing with bowing on a stone. And remember, you shall keep my Sabbaths and fear my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Thus concludes this week's portion. So we learned quite a bit about some various things that Moses was told on the mountain, and they all pertain to the Jubilee year, as well as the sabbatical year for the land, and the redemption of a slave being or destitute person among his brethren or among those just dwelling in the land. It's a very interesting list of things, and it's certainly, I think, very important to establish one of the most in modern society, probably one of our biggest dilemmas that we suffer from is debt, and also people losing what is their family estate because of some sort of debt or arrangement or bad deal. The Jubilee year guarantees that the descendants of a person will receive what they are due. They will not lose their family plot. They will always, in the end, have it returned to them. And this is one of the most beautiful things, in my opinion, about the people of Israel, is that they have these particular commandments related to the Jubilee and the return of property to those who are inheriting it. I think you really can't go wrong with this. There's very few things that measure up to this level of giving. So with that, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. I hope you found it very educational. I also found that last portion about the lack of not just idols, but also statues to be very telling. I hope we all took away something from that as well. Until next time, this has been Shmuel Moshe with the Weekly Parashahcast, portion Behar. I hope to see you next time, and I hope you'll tune on in. Until then, Baruch Hashem.